music now I wanna, can I ever refuse it? Pulsating, vibrating, reggae, reggae, reggae. Very sky, rock, a steady, mental, a quadrillion, a cool minute.
Good morning, listeners and viewers of the Real Stuff podcast. Welcome. Today we have our feature Indigenous Outlook, where we look at and discuss everything indigenous. Today we'll be looking and discussing Indigenous land rights. And we have two people who will know and be able to explain to us what that means and how it plays out in our societies. We have Miss Ping Ann Addo and Dr. Marcus Goffe. Welcome to the Real Stuff podcast.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Daly. Nice to be here with you.
Yes, I would like both of you just to introduce yourself and then we can get going.
Okay, you can go ahead, Dr. Pingan.
Good morning and thank you. Hadn't realized I was going to be speaking. I'm very much looking forward to listening and learning. I am a Trinidadian raised academic. I happen to live in Boston. I'm looking right now at the Atlantic Ocean from my work window.
Your voice is a bit low.
Forgive me. I'm going to speak up a little bit. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm dialing in from Boston, where I live and work. I was raised in Trinidad, and I have been working with the United Maroon Indigenous peoples on some of their human rights claims and work, and I'm organizing their second Maroon gathering and academic conference.
Okay.
So I'm honored to be here. Looking forward to hearing from Marcus, and glad to see that Mama Akilah Jaramogi is with us, who is also the director of the United Maroon Indigenous Peoples.
Go ahead, Marcus.
I think Mama Akilah is here, so
Yeah.
can afford the Queen's opportunity to introduce themselves. Mama Akilah, welcome. Thanks for rejoining. Brother Flavors is asking you to say a few words, just introduce yourself to the online audience.
Could you unmute, please?
Greetings, and thank you. Thank you, Marcus. I am Akilah Jaramogi from the United Maroon Indigenous Peoples and also American descendant of Trinidad. I am happy to just join in. I just plan to listen on and take in the work of and the word from Marcus. Because anything dealing with land and so on, it's way up my path because I'm a forester here in Trinidad. I live in the forest and I'm into reforestation and environmental protection. And yeah, I'm just happy to join in and hear, the delivery from Marcus today. Thank you.
Thank you, Akilah. All right, Flavors. So I'm Marcus Goffe. I'm attorney at law here in Jamaica, and I've been working with the Charleston Maroon community for some time. With their Colonel Lumsden, and now with the current Colonel Master Douglas and the council, on the annual conference and festival, and also working with the Maroon Secretariat in Jamaica, which is now reconstituted as YCIL, Yamaye Council of Indigenous Leaders here in Jamaica, representing the Windward Maroons of Charlestown, Moortown, Scotts Hall, and also the Maroon Indigenous Women's Circle, headed by Grandma Gloria Sims here in Jamaica, and also the Yamaye Taino Guani people, Hummingbird people here with us in Jamaica. So look forward to the conversation here on the Real Stuff podcast.
Okay, so Marcus, could you tell us about the topic and where this can lead us?
Right. Well, I thought you're going to introduce the topic, but it's Indigenous land rights, right?
Yes.
So it's a very broad topic, but an important topic, We're still coming to grip with the colonization of our First Nations, first people in the region. You know what I mean? We've been taught for so long that the Europeans extinguished all of the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. So, trying to reclaim identities, and lands and other resources for communities is a challenge in the face of those continuing, misconceptions of history, So when we talk about indigenous land rights, then it's something that so many persons in the Caribbean is unfamiliar, topic, because again, growing up in the colonial context, many persons would have learned that all the land belongs to the sovereign, and talk about the European sovereign, and for most of us in the Caribbean, that is the British sovereign, So indigenous land rights to many is a foreign concept, but as I say, it's an important part of acknowledging that what transpired through colonization and slavery was fundamentally wrong, and that reparations, is due to all First Nation peoples for the enslavement and the dispossession, of lands and of cultures and the subjugation of peoples by force. All of that is still unremedied in the Caribbean. So indigenous land rights really is the reclamation of the rights of indigenous peoples to lands, territories, and resources that they have traditionally owned, occupied, or used. And in that context, that is what we're speaking about. So in the Caribbean, of course, we're talking about indigenous First Nations peoples, talking about tribal peoples, Maroon peoples, talking about peoples who would have been here, let's say, prior to the colonizer, and also in the modern context of that term, we're talking about also indigenous rights, which includes even communities who have that attachment to land, even though they may not have been there prior to the colonizers, So that's what we're talking about in this context of indigenous land rights.
What would you say about, the colonizers came after we were here, people were here, and you would say those people who were here owned the lands, and the colonizers took the land away and is giving it back in some cases through treaties and all that. How do you deal with a situation like that?
Well, I think there's a misconception with treaties, so here in Jamaica we have two treaties that were signed between the Maroons and the British government. We have the 1738 treaty signed with the Leeward Maroons, right? And that's of course today headed by a compound. And then we have the 1739 treaty signed with the Windward Maroons, which is the Moortown, Charlestown, Scotsall. At that time, of course, it was Crawford Town, Nannytown, that were part of that treaty, And then people have the conception to say that because of the treaty is the British giving back people land, not giving back people land. The British didn't have the land to give in the first place, So the treaty is not a gift of land. It is a peace treaty, which was signed to bring an end to war that was started by the British, and that the British saw they could not win, and they went to the Maroons in Jamaica to conclude peace. It's not a gift. It's not a benevolent sort of action, not a receipt of land from Maroons. It is a treaty that recognizes the Maroons' pre-existing rights to land, pre-existing rights to govern themselves, and that those rights shall continue in perpetuity, meaning forever. So it's not a gift, and it's not something that was received, but it's something that was given by the British. It's a peace treaty that signed recognizing the rights of each, the British and the Maroon within this place called Jamaica.
What about where does the Tainos fit in here? Because they were the first people of Jamaica, but they don't seem to have any land rights at all.
Right. So, the Tainos again is one of those communities of history that we were told were made extinct, here in Jamaica and in the Greater Antilles, which really, if you think about that narrative, it's really a very strange narrative. But to know that the Greater Antilles are the larger of the islands in the Caribbean were populated by Tainos in significant numbers before the Spanish arrived, There was a great degree of interaction, of communication, of movement of people and of goods between the islands, So to think that the Spanish would have made every single Taino community member extinct and would have extinguished the bloodline of the Tainos completely, I think, upon reflection, we must be able to acknowledge is, complete, falsehood. And so as I said, Tainos are in the context now of a re-emergence, in the English-speaking Caribbean. Because of course, in the Greater Antilles, looking at like Puerto Rico, they're very active sort of Taino communities there, but in the islands, as I say, we were told that they were extinct. And so in that context now, there has not been historically, right, a continuity of Taino tradition, at least not upfront, because I would say that there's been a lot of suppression of Taino ancestry. Many people in Jamaica know that they're Tainos, but don't readily recognize themselves as same because of being subjected to to be mocked, and jeered, and of course to be denied, and so we're now in a phase, I would say, in recent years, primarily, I would say, advanced through the installment of Taino Kasikeíani, in 2015, which would have, I believe 2015, I'm wrong, which has galvanized then that sort of re-emergence and re-identification of persons as Taino in Jamaica, and facilitated, rising of the Taino culture and tradition that were here before, resurrection of the Taino language and traditions. And so it's a very historic process, an important process, I think, recognizing that the Tainos were, I say, the first victims in Jamaica of genocide, and so are also very much deserving of reparations from the colonizers and from contemporary governments who are successors, right, of the colonizers. So in that resurrection and in this resurgence and reclamation, definitely land rights is a big part of it. What we've been doing in Jamaica as Kyle and with the Yamaye Taino group headed by Kasikeíani is to primarily, in the first instance, look at preserving Taino heritage sites and sacred sites, sacred spaces, which are again historically documented because we know which parts of Jamaica there has been, findings of artifacts and historical records of communities of Tainos living there and other retentions, from archaeology and so forth. So it's about identifying those sites, being able to have the government of Jamaica, agree to preserve and protect those sites and to recognize those sites as Taino sites and to facilitate the Taino community being able to re-engage with those sites, to resurrect and continue ceremonies and so forth, and connection to ancestors. The Taino community has had several annual celebrations which have been again revived, with a view to being able to again rise the level of Taino awareness and culture here in Jamaica. So land rights definitely is a part of that too, because no indigenous community can survive without that connection to land. Land is the life force that brings continuity of family and um, of closeness to ancestors and to resources and the land and so forth. And so the Taino community moving forward will definitely need to have access to land to be able to continue to do traditions and ceremonies and to grow and stabilize the community as it reemerges.
Okay, so let's get to the meat of the matter now. Where are we today with indigenous land rights, and where do you see it going in the future, in the near future, midterm and long term?
I think that in the Caribbean, I think we have a growing appreciation that the narratives that we were all taught in school are wrong about the extinction of indigenous peoples. I think that there's a growing awareness about indigenous rights, including indigenous land rights in the Caribbean, in Jamaica as well too. And so I would say that our Caribbean governments are slowly come to the realization that there must be, legal processes and mechanisms put in place to be able to properly restore lands, and other rights to indigenous communities, and that has been brought, in no, in a very important way through the activism of the communities themselves, right? We've seen where many communities have taken the governments in the Caribbean to court, right? To the Inter-American Court, and to other forums, national courts, etc., to have their land rights asserted, right? And so we've seen, for example, the Maroons of Suriname have been, from a long time very active in the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights and the Inter-American Court for Human Rights. They've done several court judgments there that assert and confirm and affirm their land rights, and so those are standing legal precedents that will continue to have a positive impact in the Caribbean as it relates to land rights. Now, of course, the Suriname government has not been properly recognized and implemented those court rulings against them, right? But nonetheless, as I say, those court rulings stand and continue to be the basis of continued advocacy in those communities, and of course, we've had similar precedents to in the Belize context. We've had the Maya in Belize, that the Belize government to court, all the way through to the CCJ. And again, I've gotten favorable rulings, at each stage, which confirm and affirm Belize or Maya's land rights in Belize. We've had judgments recently from the Inter-American Court as well concerning the Locono and Arawak communities in Honduras. And so, generally speaking, I would say that the current state of jurisprudence in the Caribbean is very much supportive of the recognition of indigenous people's rights, including land rights, and so I would say that I would expect within the next 20 years, I would say within the next 20 years, I would expect us to have in the Caribbean a whole raft of laws and legal court precedents which affirm indigenous land rights. And so, in my estimation, I would say that we are now in that era of restoration, of reparation concerning indigenous rights globally and in the Caribbean.
Where do you see it going? I mean, is there a positive outlook?
Yeah, definitely. I'm saying I think that based on what we have now as jurisprudence, we will be getting our communities' rights recognized legally within the next 20 years in the Caribbean.
Okay.
In Jamaica, I would say we probably are ahead of that 20-year time frame. We're having, of course, challenges now in the Jamaican context with indigenous land rights be recognized in Jamaica, you know. But, you know, recently we've taken the government of Jamaica to the Inter-American Commission ourselves for Human Rights. That's why I call. And so has their compound Maroon community as well too, you know. And so, as I say, I think that one way or the other, you know, either through litigation or negotiation, I think that we would definitely have our land rights recognized. You know, so in Jamaica, I would say that we probably at this stage, I would want to say within another 10 years, you know, this is an issue that is definitely on the national agenda here in Jamaica, an issue which is a part of what in the upcoming elections will have to be, you know, a deciding factor, you know, on the ballot in many respects. And so I think that's definitely, you know, the outlook is very positive for Indigenous land rights recognition.
You keep mentioning reparation. How do you see reparation playing out with land rights?
Well, you know, I would say first that reparations is not limited to the transatlantic slave trade context. You know, it's a legal concept that is broad and it's not limited to law only, you know. So oftentimes, you know, because reparations has been very topical in the context of slavery and transatlantic slave trade, then persons think that reparations is limited to that context. But I use the term much more broadly to refer to any of those kind of systematic instances of injustice that are historical, for which there has not been any sort of rectification or remedy that has been obtained, you know. And so it is to essentially repair and to restore and to atone for those historical wrongs, right? So in terms of atoning for historical wrongs concerning indigenous peoples, then land rights is at the center of that, you know, because I say land rights is at the center of indigenous peoples, you know, communities and livelihoods and ideologies, and you know, was definitely at the center of the slavery and colonization project, you know, of Europe in the Caribbean. You know, it was definitely one of the core atrocities that were committed in terms of the dispossession of lands, right, of indigenous communities by European nations, and so must be a central part of any future reparative framework, right? The reparatory justice framework concerning indigenous peoples must have as a central plank the issue of restoration and recognition, you know, legally, and protection of indigenous land rights. You know? So reparation in that context, I think, must include that. You know, so even the CARICOM 10-point plan, looking at transatlantic slave trade, does also look at colonization in the Caribbean and reparation in the context of indigenous reparation, indigenous communities. You know. But as I say, for me, reparations also is an internal process as well too, because we know that even after the European governments divested themselves of power in the Caribbean and handed over the reins of political power to locals in the region, there have been continuing atrocities committed against indigenous communities, right, since so-called independence, right? And so reparations also due to those communities locally within an internal context. Doesn't depend on, you know, the transatlantic slave trade and the negotiation with the European governments, but it's something that we can and must do now internally, recognizing that those who are in political power up to now, right, as we celebrate 50 and 60 odd years of independence in the Caribbean, many of these leaders have perpetuated, you know, the wrongs and the myths and the injustices against indigenous peoples. And so reparations also is targeted at them as well to restore the wrongs and to repair the wrongs and to atone for those wrongs against indigenous peoples in the Caribbean.
In today's, what is happening today, are you seeing the leaders in the Caribbean, are they hindering or assisting in this whole process?
Leaders meaning leaders of
Governments
governments?
in the Caribbean, yes.
I would say that we have some leaders who are more, proactive and progressive in that regard. We have some who are still very, I think, colonially minded in that regard, you know. So it's ongoing work. I think that this is something that we would love to have at the CARICOM level addressed. Historically, we had a more active indigenous peoples forum or advocacy and lobbying at the CARICOM level. And so I think it's important for us to galvanize in that respect because at the CARICOM level, CARICOM speaks to, in some of its founding documents, the principles of protecting indigenous people's rights, recognizing and protecting their culture, and so forth. But we haven't had very much CARICOM-led efforts at that, you know. We've not had very many Caribbean-led initiatives around indigenous people's rights. And so it's really been many countries in the Caribbean doing their own sort of, paths. And so Trinidad and Tobago, has been very progressive in that respect, and we see how they recognize the Santa Rosa people there, and we see what Mama Akilah is doing with the American community there. And we know that the government in Trinidad and Tobago, seems from where we sit to be more engaging with their communities, than let's say the government here in Jamaica, for example. You know what I mean? We know that in Guyana, again, we have more land rights recognition from indigenous peoples, but we also have, continuing problems legally, right, with recognition there, as they have not discovered oil, a lot of land, lack of investment is there, and indigenous people land rights are still very vulnerable, even though, let's say, they do have recognition more than we have here in Jamaica too, Dominica, similarly, in Dominica, we have, of course, historically, I would say, the most favorable legal context for indigenous peoples. Again, not ideal in the context of international law in the 21st century, but they have had a certain level of indigenous land rights recognition, right? From very early, about 1902, so varying countries in the Caribbean are at varying stages and have tried to deal with this issue in different ways, So there isn't that kind of concerted approach in that regard, And I say, because of the common law, English common law that prevails in the Caribbean, right? Then many of the countries in the Caribbean, of course, continue to follow the English common laws, precedents and systems are still reluctant to acknowledge and to recognize indigenous land rights, within their legal systems, And so I really can say overall in the Caribbean that, our leaders are supportive. But what I would say is that we have some leaders, some countries who I think are very progressive in this area. You have some, like at present Jamaica, who I think is, lagging behind stubbornly, But I think that, as I said, the tide of justice and the tide of international law and regional law and jurisprudence is such that I don't think any of the leaders can resist indigenous land rights recognition, and I say, in the years to come.
But you think that's all because the government's not really recognizing people as being indigenous, as apart from being national?
Right, right.
Like the Maroons in Jamaica. They are Maroons, but they're also Jamaicans.
Right. Some of these kind of concepts are new to us in this part of the world, I would say, because these are things that have been addressed, I would say, internationally, from ever since, from the decolonization process started, which is, of course, in the mid 20th century. And these have been discussions that have been going on around the world. But because Jamaica and the English Caribbean has been left out or has left itself out, oftentimes, because we said that we have no indigenous peoples, we didn't participate in, conventions and treaties and international conferences and forums on indigenous people's rights, But certainly, over the last, yes, over the last 75 years, right, we can see that there have been a plethora of international agreements and conventions and treaties which recognize and protect indigenous rights, And so many countries in the Caribbean are afraid of recognizing that they have indigenous peoples in their territories because they are reluctant to acknowledge that they have legal obligations to those indigenous communities by virtue of those international treaties. And so they're more content to put their head in the sand and to pretend as if they ignore the issue, and to perpetuate us and to continue to ride on the laurels of their colonizer, the ones who they're succeeding, right? Legal ancestors. So that's a problem still, I think. And I see primarily because they don't want to commit the funds, they don't want to have to change their legal system, they don't want to have to, channel resources, they don't want to have to, change the whole colonial narrative that they have inherited, that says that it's not all the crown's land, and it's not okay to have indigenous peoples, to exist under freedom of society, while we continue to enjoy and reap the fruits of, of the crimes committed against them, So, as I say, I think that's the rationale for many countries in the Caribbean not wanting to properly engage. But as I say, those issues are issues that I think are well discussed and established, And so in Latin America, again, you have over 50 years of jurisprudence and of national laws and policies that relate to indigenous people. It's not known that they're dealing with these issues. Again, it's not perfect there because over the years there's been a lot of strife over land rights, over indigenous rights. It still continues, as we know, in the Amazon and elsewhere, but they're not now coming to the table fresh, right? As we are in the Caribbean around these issues, because as I say, in the course of decolonization, these issues were addressed frontally, or at least they were raised for discussion in that climate, whereas here in the Caribbean, those issues were never ever on the decolonization agenda or on the independence agenda, in the independence constitutional, processes at no time in the Caribbean. Apart from maybe 92, Belize and Guyana, there's never been a kind of national discussion around indigenous rights as a part of the national political agenda, But as I said, that's changed now. And I think that, the tide of change is in our favor.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask our guests to come into the discussion, please.
Sure. You have any questions for them, or?
Yeah, questions or thoughts or, please enrich
yes.
our discussion.
Thank you. And as always, we put our trust in people like Marcus who can truly deliver, on behalf of our people, because being on the ground, you can understand what is happening. So it's not just from the desk he's speaking from his heart and being a true foot soldier on the ground. Being around different groups, communities that have tried the challenges and hence for me, what I've seen over the years in the Caribbean, I'm seeing a shift, not just in the Caribbean, but in Latin America and North America as well, where you have indigenous communities standing up and speaking out. I say thanks to the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent and Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, where a lot of them take the opportunity to go before these forums and highlight their challenges. But it's for the governments of the region and so on to listen and take heed, because while we out there and we highlight our concerns, little shift is being made. But we need to see it from CARICOM, we need to see it from the governments of the region, and also the people, for them to understand what their rights are and truly, be consistent with the struggle. Hence the reason why our event from the 5th to the 9th of November, we will be also addressing some of these issues: sustainable livelihoods and indigenous communities in the Caribbean. We're looking at land rights, and spirituality and all these things. So again, we just have to keep the conversation going and keep advocating for what we want and support our brothers and sisters, our indigenous brothers and sisters throughout the region. And I say thanks to, people like Marcus and Sister Pingan and others, Malene, Alain, and all these sisters and brothers, who stand in defense of indigenous and grassroots and tribal communities throughout the region. Again, and we will that and making sure that justice is served. I share.
Wonderful.
Hi there.
Yes, go ahead, Diana.
Hi, nice to join in. Marcus, good to hear you talk.
Hi, Diana.
Hi. I'm speaking to you from my office in the United States, where I am now, transition. I joined late because I was in a class, but I don't know whether you touched on climate crisis, but that strikes me as one of the ways that the world is waking up to the value of Indigenous peoples and that long-term connection with the land and approaches to sustainability that are connected to world views. So that is, I think, one of the critical contributions that the non-Indigenous world is starting to realize, that Indigenous peoples have solutions, ways of thinking, being, and doing that can be valuable for all of us. And in some ways, it's a sad thing that there has to be a kind of benefit to self for that view to be expanded, that, the inherent value of Indigenous peoples comes after recognizing the value to themselves. That's one way to look at it. But I think that it's that kind of thing that may take the governments, some of them that are slower to recognize Indigenous peoples, like the government of Jamaica, to come on board, seeing the value for their own well-being and survival.
Good point. Good point. Yeah, no, yes, definitely. Climate change and environmental justice, I think definitely that's a big factor that has led to people now looking back to indigenous peoples and traditional knowledge, and to find some solutions on culture and, coastal loss and, all these issues that, again, we think that, our first peoples don't have answers to, because we think everything is about technology now, but we have to go back to these kinds of, thinkings and knowledge, and to see wisdom in it. I mean, I think in the Caribbean, I guess globally too, but in the Caribbean, we still have a very heavy, thinking that local people, traditional people are uncivilized, and are backward, not educated, don't know anything, and therefore not worthy to be listened to. So it's a big issue, And so we still have a lot of that kind of colonial baggage to throw off, but hopefully through some of these processes, we can accomplish some of that,
Yeah, I mean, the
Good.
concept, sorry.
Sorry. Go ahead.
I'm just going to add really quickly that that many people are even unfamiliar with the concept of indigeneity, and they do associate, those other ideas of simple and backward and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of educational work to do, and I think that one of the things that is clear with Caribbean populations is that there's a value of a great valuing of education, and so if these kinds of issues can be woven into national educational curriculum and starting also early programs for children, then I think that down the road people will grow up with these kinds of ideas, challenging earlier histories that still talk about indigenous extinction. So starting young.
The childhood education, yes. Chieftainess?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Chieftainess Ronalda, Yamaye, Guani, Taino peoples of Jamaica, I might add. I honestly, I do believe that, everything that Dr. Fox has shared before, and even Akilah. From my perspective, if there is no respect, acknowledgement from the government, then a lot of the work that we are currently doing, a lot of the work that we have been doing will not be recognized in its rightful place. Because if we don't have any rights to do so, then it's very easy for anybody, any foreign entity, even within our own country, to come and just disrupt everything that we have done before. We can't even protect the lands that we have. Look at the situation with White Maroon. They're still planning to cut through the ancestral place, one of our major ancestral places, where there is still the original placements of the bohio from our Taino ancestors. There's still artifacts that are there, and the government is still planning to cut through that for based on what they call the betterment of the country. So if there's no indigenous rights to protect those lands, all the work that we're doing, we still have to do, because we have future generations that is coming. But it to me, it doesn't have a good foundation to stand on. And so our fight will still have to be, again, getting our rights acknowledged by the government of Jamaica or by the individual Caribbean countries, because everything that Dr. Fox has shared regarding indigenous people, we know the way of the land will be for nothing. Because if we are protecting our land and then the government is going to be like, all right, cool, we want better highways, we want more roads for the cars to pass through, then all of our traditional work, all of our ceremonies that we do for our ancestors will just go down the drain, just like everything that has been happening now. There's been many cases, especially in Jamaica. There was one recently in Montego Bay, where it's a Taino site, and they were digging up the place. This lady was on the TV crying because she couldn't find the grave of her ancestor, and it's also another well-known Taino site. So we have no rights to protect these things, and that's why it should be one of our major focuses as Indigenous people, along with great like Dr. Goffe and his wife Danielle Andrade Goffe, that is doing the work, especially along with the Escazú agreement, even getting that ratified. Those are the things that will ensure that we have even a land space to live on, or we can even go further into climate justice, looking at climate resilient methods, creating spaces for our future generations. One of our Taino line is that we continue to do the work for 7 generations in the future. So every successive generation that comes is doing the work for the next 7 generations. And so again, final thoughts, without our Indigenous rights being acknowledged, being ratified, it almost seems as if we're doing the work for naught. And so I end. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I just want to add one thing here. We got to start changing the narrative and be really serious about it. We got to bring those stories alive. We got to call at all levels to come on board. The storytellers, the media, the musicians, we got to come out and advocate for truth. Because the first thing the colonizers did is remap our space. They came in and they start cutting up and sharing and start pushing our people away. We got to start identifying the different groups, the different indigenous groups, and map out where they were. And let's tell the truth. Let's tell the stories. And bit by bit, put the liars and the criminals to shame. This is what we have to do. And eventually the government and others will come on board, but we have rights to truth. And let us, execute those rights. So I say thanks again and blessings to all. And we continue to stand for truth, right, and justice for our indigenous peoples globally. Ashe.
That's right. I love that, Akilah. I love that, because, as what even Diana was saying, we don't want people to recognize indigenous people just because they say, oh, yes, it's true, they can help us to solve climate change. I think fundamentally you must recognize that what was done was wrong, and all the evils that were done. I think, we can't sweep it underneath the carpet. And sometimes I feel like in the Caribbean, oftentimes we don't want to confront these harsh realities. Nobody wants to call out the royal family for all the crime that they've done, And I'm saying that how are we going to properly recognize indigenous people's rights if we're not prepared to call out all of those that of the past, those crimes? Only then can you say, all right, we understand now, and we have to start from a different perspective to be able to properly do justice to the indigenous communities. We can't continue to hold on to, King Charles and his ancestors' ideologies and still at the same time hoping to now do justice to our indigenous people. And that's why I talk about reparation. It starts off with an apology, right? So you have to recognize the wrong and sincerely apologize for the wrong. And then how you can move towards some structured mechanism that institutions to address and to repair the wrong. And until then, as you say, it's like a partial, it's like a favor you're doing us. I don't want a favor. And a handout. It's not poor relief. It's not welfare. So I think sometimes people think about this thing like Maroon want land, like you're asking for a piece of land to do, it's not a welfare and a privilege and a handout. It's a right, and it's a right to justice and it's to truth, and we can't go anywhere without that being first. And so I'm saying, countries like America, when they go through and they fight off the British and then do everything and they start a constitution, they have a revolutionary mindset that's starting up new nation. But what's we in the Caribbean now? We sign a nice, independent constitution. Nobody never ruffled the feathers. Nobody never call out nobody. We're just smooth and continuous. Then we are trapped in that mindset. We will have to be able to call out the wrongs, to be able to clear that mental space and spiritual space, to be able to do justice, So I would love to see us in the Caribbean as well, calling out some of these governments for true, calling them out, because continuing to hold on to the legacy of slavery and talking about we're independent and we're doing this and that. Can't work, Mama Akilah, oh, you're on mute, that's why you're talking. Okay. So Mr. Host, Mr. Lately,
Yes,
any questions?
no, I'm
Yes, sir.
asking Dr. Addo. We haven't heard from her at all.
Hi, good afternoon again. Sorry about I'm having a bit of a bad connection here, so I hope you hear everything. I don't have that much to add because my colleagues have done a really wonderful job.
Excellent job, yes.
Glad to see Chieftainess Ronalda. I haven't seen her in a while. But one thing that strikes me, just like Professor Diana Fox, I am also an anthropologist. I'm a university professor, and we are in a unique position to talk to young people on a daily basis in our classes and through our mentoring about what they can do, whether they're Indigenous or not. Like so far, we've been talking a lot about what Indigenous communities can be doing to stand for themselves and what governments should be doing to listen to what's being said. But there's all this space in between and voices in between the really empowered governments and Indigenous communities of people who want to be allies and are willing to, put their voices out there, sometimes put their bodies on the line in direct action. But I think it's really important that we think about popular education. And I think there is, ever since, the information age, we have been able to spread so much information, sometimes disinformation. But I think it's really important to harness those technologies, to harness those connections, and make sure that we are always reminding the young people, especially that we are teaching or that we are just walking next to in life, our children's friends, just motivate them to realize that, like you said, Chieftainess Ronalda, you have to think several generations down, preferably 7 generations down. Most young people, many young people can think about this generation, but they can barely picture what the next is going to look like. Can they even picture what a world without, an earth without resources looks like? They have to be willing to go in their own minds to some of the most dire situations and realize not just that Indigenous communities have a lot of the answers for, if not halting, maybe reversing some of the devastating climate change effects, but also that Indigenous communities can't do it alone. And so the rest of us are called to be allies and to continue to move forward and listen to those wisdoms. And so those who are willing to be convinced, who are convinced now of their part in supporting Indigenous communities, have to amplify that message even louder for everyone else who also hasn't thought about it in those ways. Because Indigenous people alone cannot save this earth. Indigenous people alone cannot save, cannot turn around what governments are willing to do. Populations, through popular education, even through the way that nations and communities can revolutionize tourism. All of those things have to come into play. So it's holistic. So this is something for everybody to take part in, not just governments, not just Indigenous communities, not just university professors, not just lawyers, right? We all have a role. So we need to educate ourselves. We need to fall in step. We need to come on board, and we need to be unafraid, because what do we have to lose? Everything. So we have to start now. And it's global as well. It's not just local, right? This conversation is happening globally. My students are hoping to watch the recording of this, right? Because they want to help. So thank you for creating the forum.
Wonderful, thank you, yes. I think this has been a very excellent discussion on the topic. So Marcus, can you close off for us now, please?
Well, just to say that, yeah, these are ongoing conversations, and I'm glad that we have, these mediums to be able to reach persons, and it's an ongoing learning opportunity, and sharing opportunity, because there's so much that, we don't know about history, I think, or that we think we know, but probably it's not appropriately balanced, and there's also a lot that we can do, wherever we are, to advance justice globally, justice for Indigenous people, Indigenous rights, Indigenous land rights, So I'm hoping that through this conversation, we've been able to, spark some interest, or to maybe, fuel persons' interest that they have already to get involved in some respect. We have lots of communities across the Caribbean who would welcome support. whether in terms of projects, in terms of research, in terms of advocacy, organizing. And so, yeah, we really want to let people know that the indigenous people of the Caribbean are very much here and present, very much alive and well and wanting to have, communities and societies, that are properly respectful of us and our rights and mindful of our legitimate aspirations, And so it's not against people. I think oftentimes, and this is again a global thing, right? We see it in Canada and Australia, USA, when we talk about indigenous people's rights, then non-indigenous peoples feel threatened that they're going to take away our land, they're going to feel like you're a special person over us. And it gets, contentious. Again, it's not that all societies have had to engage in a decolonizing, a decolonial process, And so we don't want to see it as an us and them. It's not about indigenous peoples taking back or taking what or claiming from. It's about a reconciliation, recognizing that the legacies of those wrongs have continued to harm individuals and communities and societies and overall progress, and development, and that there's a need, therefore, to, let's say, right some of those wrongs. And that may mean that we have to adjust how we think about things, So, for example, sovereignty, right? That's a word that we've heard here in Jamaica, and we've seen, the Prime Minister of Jamaica and the chief of a compound spar over that word sovereignty. And, the feelings that sovereignty is only something that nations, in terms of the, United Nations, can claim, and that communities can't claim sovereignty, So all of these kind of concepts are really, again, things that we should be open-minded enough to re-examine and re-evaluate, you know what I mean? Appreciating that a lot of these concepts, like I say, were things that were developed by a certain, European, Christian, colonial, white mindset. And therefore, we deserve to, as I say, in this modern context, reevaluate all of that, and to be able to properly appreciate what indigenous peoples have gone through and are continuing to go through, and how we can, as I say, right some of these historical wrongs of history, So, and I say, thanks to the real stuff, to you, Flavius, and to Courtney and the team, and look forward to having more of these conversations, as we can hope to strengthen and just continue to support, the advocacy for indigenous rights in the Caribbean.
Thank you very much, and thank all our guests also. And just to say, we definitely will be having more of this, and that Indigenous Outlook is a platform created for this kind of discussion by indigenous people. Not people talking down to us or about us, but we ourselves discussing, what we need, what we should do, and all of that. So just an open invitation that anytime you need to discuss anything like that, you can just call us and we will arrange it. But apart from that, we definitely need a part 2 for this, because this was, this like it can't end, And it was so wonderful. So thank you all. Thank you all. And thank you very much, Marcus.
Thank you, Matupe. Thank you.
Yes.
You're welcome.
Okay. So we'll be in touch.
Okay. Have a good day, all.
Yes.
You lead us so full. You belong far away away. Ajugwala lebobu seru. Lida mua, lida sungfula. Lida mua, lida sungfula.
Well, unfortunately, this is it. Till next time. Bless.
All you gotta do is just speak one word. forget what I was trying to say. I no longer do what I was gonna do, but you're no good for me. That's why me know what set me if it could flee. Me have to take away me say. Me have to take away me say. Me have to hide like a thief in the night. Me have to get out the side. Me have to take away me say. Have to take away myself. I have to utilize thy wings. Surely I